Let us not create projects and then declare them to be important components of the residual mechanism. We need education. We need to construct our historic collective memory. Allow us to do things at the local level. Please don't come with ideas whereby some new mechanisms would be introduced which would not actually be of assistance to us. The outreach program was not of much use to us either because it came completely from the top. We need initiatives from the ground up. This is something that would need to be supported and nurtured.
So let me open this up to the panelists to address some of the comments and comment raised here. There's been questions about the location of the archives. Many localities would like it located in their particular area. There's been a question about whether it's the possibilities of declassification of documents that were provided by the Serbian government. And also, before I hand to the floor, let me say that the ICTY for 16 years has been hearing evidence of your experiences, rape, torture, and all the other crimes. And this is what we are about now. We want to preserve this. So I do respect and sympathize with your experiences. But we want to get more clearer answers, and that's what the panel is also willing to help with. So anybody? Conrad?
The issue of location, and we've just heard it, is a very sensitive issue and highly emotional. I've the utmost respect of the experiences we've heard of the victims in participating at this conference. It is an issue that will need careful consideration, but I would like to once again point at two issues. One was stressed already, is the question about originals and copies. For outreach, for preserving the memory, for prevention, is it necessary to have the copies? That's one question. On the other hand, the second point I would like to make is the question of trial of the fugitives. For the trial of the fugitives, detaining criminals at large, it will be necessary for the mechanism to have access to the originals of those documents and records. So, as I had tried to stress earlier, it is a package. The mechanism will have to be co-located with the archives. So I would like to ask everybody to bear in mind, if you want at someday Mr. Mladic will be apprehended, in order to conduct the trial against Mladic, the mechanism will have to have access to the originals and to the archives. And maybe the question of location of the archives in the region is something in the longer or medium or longer term, but in the short term it will be necessary to have it co-located. Thank you.
So what about the possibility of copies being made available at various locations?
I think that's really part of the notion of establishing information center, really. Just to answer Natasha's concern, the idea is not to institute places where sole access to the material, and again, copies, electronic or hard copies of the public documents would be accessible. The idea is to, via those centers, actually assist those who need access in the region. And there are people working in the NGO field, there are people working in law faculties, people working with missing persons, etc., having the best access and the fullest access to the materials. So if we're talking about full sets of certified copies of material, but the idea I have is make it as widely accessible to those who need it and those who are expressing an interest in having access to it, and who, as partners, then can do their work and can share even wider the information in question. I know about the reservation that Natasha Kondic has about this project. I also heard a number of other actors of the civil society in all the countries I've met with who said, well, we need it. And we believe that if the only access we have is a possibility of going into wherever the archives are, whether in the region or elsewhere, or accessing the web, and this very dry and remote access that the web gives us, well, we prefer the idea of an information center which will help us build on the material, use it properly, and also get research done about it. I'm talking about NGOs. I also heard information centers, research centers, documentation centers, representative who actually express the same interest. So I just wanted to show that the picture is maybe a bit more varied than what we have said so far could give the impression.
Well, thank you for that clarification. I'm afraid time's catching up, but I did, recognize one speaker. I'm sorry, that will have to be the last input from the audience. So go ahead.
Želim da vas pozdravim ispred Republike.
I am here on behalf of the Republican Center for Investigations into War Crimes, active with the Ministry of Justice of Republika Srpska, Janko Velimirović, acting director. I would like to follow up on what Mrs. Natasha Kandic said. The government and the National Assembly of Republika Srpska are of the position that all the original documentation, primarily the documentation taken out of the institutions of the Republika Srpska, should be returned to their rightful owners. There is disagreement on this issue within Bosnia and Herzegovina because the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina in March 2008 raised this issue, and the Serb member of the presidency placed a veto on this decision, considering it to be a destructive sort of policy to have that documentation returned to Republika Srpska. Following that, the parliament was in session and carried a decision whereby all the original documentation that had been seized forcibly or not, be returned to their rightful owners. Legislation was adopted to this effect, and therefore the Republika Srpska has in fact the legal basis to repossess its original documentation. Thank you.
So that's an important legal consideration as well. And now I invite the panelists. Is there any final submissions? We have a minute or two. Yes, Larry.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to what you mentioned at the very beginning, is how these archives are used. And being a rather simplistic, and for what, exactly for what purposes, but being a rather simplistic person, I see that in sort of two big categories. One is for what I call government purposes, which is really purposes of prosecution and investigation for the future. And as Conrad said, the residual mechanism is going to need access to the archives for that purpose. And for 11 bis, but category 2, those files that are sent to the prosecutors in the region are being sent from one OTP, confidential, it's not in the public domain, to the prosecutors in the region, again for OTP prosecution purposes. And presumably anything that goes to court will be then subject to whatever rules of access for court records and transcripts, and we've been dealing with all of that. And ICTY has a declassification working group to deal with what parts of those archives can be declassified for public disclosure, as it were. But my little concern has to do with what I call raw materials. Because, as I understand, some of the, and as Serge Braumert said today, all of the materials going to national prosecutors may not be used in any prosecution, but you may have files with pure allegations that are sitting there that will never be used in any national prosecution or international prosecution. What happens to those? Absent any oversight or any conditions that flow with the transfer, it will be up to the national local authorities to decide what to do with these files that have pure allegations, hearsay, that have never been tested. And I think both the prosecutors' offices and the human rights organizations in the regions should look at that, because we had the problem in 1987 with regard to World War II war crimes files. And the decision was taken at that time, but that's 40 years after the fact, that anybody outside of government purposes that is granted access must have a disclaimer, if they ever publish it, that says these materials have never been subject to the judicial process, may have unsubstantiated allegations, and may be hearsay. But otherwise, when you spoke about abuse, abuse can go the other way too. When someone gets a hold of an accusation, which has never been subjected to any judicial process, and the next day you see it in the newspaper that your father or your grandfather was a war criminal. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I want to thank all the panelists for their tremendous contribution, and to you, the audience, for your participation.